Good evening, everyone. My name's Rob Reish. I teach in the political science department here at Stanford, and I serve as the faculty director of the program in ethics and society. I'm really pleased to welcome you tonight to the presentation by Professor John Taylor in the Ethics of Wealth series, sponsored by the McCoy Family Center on Ethics and Society and co-sponsored by many other entities on campus. I want to take a quick moment just to recognize the presence of Buzz and Barbara McCoy, who are here tonight, the endowers of our center, and thank them very much for their presence. For those of you who are regulars in the series, you may already know a bit about ethics and society, but for those of you who are new, I want to take just a minute or two before introducing John Taylor and tell you a bit about what the center does. So Ethics and Society is an interdisciplinary center committed to bringing ethical reflection to bear on important social problems through research, teaching, and engagement. One of the leading and guiding ideas of the center is that the major problems that face our society and indeed our globe, extreme poverty, environmental sustainability, international peace and security, among others, are not only technological in nature, but moral. Our series of public presentations and discussion on the topic of ethics of wealth seeks to stimulate discussion on these topics. Human beings have sought to amass wealth, but they've also condemned it as a source of human corruption. Social science, theology, and philosophy have long been home to intense debates about the implications of wealth for happiness, for virtue, for justice, and democracy. Artists and writers, too, have critically explored the relationship between money and humanity. The Center on Ethics and Society, along with several other campus partners, seeks to stimulate public discussion on such questions. What is the relationship between financial success and a flourishing life? Does wealth make people happy? Is inheritance a legitimate thing? Is large wealth inequality fair? Are large wealth inequalities damaging to democracy? What are the moral obligations of the wealthy to those in need? For those of you who are regulars, you'll know some of the previous speakers in our series. They've included people like the artist Josh Kornbluth, or most recently, just last month, the economist Emmanuel Saez. There's a full schedule of events in the Ethics of Wealth series planned for next quarter, and I hope you had a chance to pick up a small little bookmark that includes the full schedule outside. One other small advertisement. The undergraduate program in Ethics and Society, which is a very small program, graduates no more than 10 or 12 people a year with an honors degree, is, along with the center, hosting in 2 days what I think will be the largest event of the year for us. Rachel Maddow from the Rachel Maddow Show is coming to campus in 2 days. I believe it's sold out, but possibly with any free seats still available at the door. She was a graduate of the Ethics and Society program about 15 years ago, and she'll be coming to talk about her most recent book called Drift. So tonight, we are honored to have a presentation by one of Stanford's best-known professors, John Taylor, from the economics department. Professor Taylor will be talking about economic freedom, wealth, and the alleviation of poverty. John Taylor is a professor of economics at Stanford and serves as a fellow at the Hoover Institution, and he's most widely known for his research on the foundations of modern monetary theory and policy and his experience in international economics. Professor Taylor proposed the so-called Taylor Rule in 1993, which central banks across the world have used since then to help determine interest rates. He served as senior economist on President Ford's and President Carter's Council of Economic Advisors, and is a member of President George H.W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors from 1989 through 1991. He was a member of the Congressional Budget Office's Panel of Economic Advisors 1995 to 2001, and a senior economic advisor to the Bob Dole presidential campaign in 1996, the George W. Bush presidential campaign in 2000, the John McCain campaign in 2008, and most recently the Mitt Romney campaign in 2012. In this very room, Professor Taylor frequently teaches the Intro to Economics class at Stanford Econ 1, one of the university's most popular and legendary undergraduate classes. One small thing I think worth adding here, John is the owner of one of my very favorite neckties. Unfortunately, he's not wearing it tonight, but he owns a blue necktie on which is emblazoned the words, "Democracy is not a spectator sport." It's one of the things I know that he urges his students to internalize in his classes, and it's among the reasons I'm sure that he's widely admired amongst the undergraduate student body. The format for tonight, John will give a presentation for approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll have a short period of question and answers where the microphones will be out in the audience. Please join me in welcoming John Taylor.
Thank you very much, Rob and Deborah, for inviting me. It's a real honor for me to speak to this group in the center, and I really thank Buzz and Barbara for being here too. Long-time friends. It's really great to see you. So I'm going to talk about the economy. I'm an economist. What do you expect? And I think I'm a little concerned, because I'm concerned about the economy. In a way, my theme is there's a lot to be concerned about. Of course, some things are going well. The stock market looks good. But basically, we've got some real concerns. And I want to talk a little bit about how I think about we should be dealing with those concerns. And I'm going to stress the idea of freedom, in fact, economic freedom. I'll talk about that as I get there. And so my introductory slide here, to me, is important because it has Stanford's seal, which, of course, the Alleviate, let the winds of freedom blow. And so by the time we're finished, I think you're going to see why I think we should let the winds of economic freedom blow, and I'll give you some more details about that. So if you look around the country right now, we have a high unemployment rate. It's nationwide, 7.7. San Francisco, it's better, 6.7. The state as a whole, it's about 9.8. If you go a little east of here to the Central Valley, Fresno, et cetera, it's about 15%. If you go south to El Centro, it's about 26, 27%. So this is pretty serious, it seems to me. You also have a situation where incomes have not grown very much in recent years. Poverty is higher than it's been for a long time. And as we know from earlier presentations here, Emmanuel Assayas, for example, the income distribution seems to be widening. And even worse, some economists are finding that the income mobility across generations is not what we thought it was in the United States. So there's a concern here. And so I want to talk about that. And when I think about these concerns, I'd like to start where we are right now, if you like, just to get where we are and then kind of broaden it, because I have an interpretation of where we are now, but it's a broad interpretation of how we got here as well. So my first slide is just a picture of where we are. To me, this is a helpful way to think about it. It's the economy. Economists like to use GDP, gross domestic product, to describe the total amount of production in the economy. And this chart goes back to 2007, and you can see the recession. That was where the blue line goes down. That's our measure of total real gross domestic product adjusted for inflation. And then the other line is called potential GDP. That's a measure that the Congressional Budget Office feels is where we could be, if you like. It's the economy's potential. So it's going right along, and in the meantime, we've fallen off that potential. And unfortunately, and this is the concern, if you like, we haven't gotten back towards it as best we can figure. Yes, there's been growth. You can see the blue lines moving up over time, but it's really not moving much faster so far than the red line. So that gap is really the problem. That's what's causing unemployment to remain high. If you compare this with earlier times in history, it looks quite different. So for example, this is the same picture for the previous deep recession we had in the United States. This was in the 1980, 81, 82. The same concept here. You have this estimate of where the economy could be going. That's potential GDP. And the blue line shows you the recovery, if you like. Now, this is really a recovery which is about 3 times faster than this recent recovery. So there's something disappointing here. Not only did we have this terrible financial crisis, we've had a very slow recovery compared to previous deep recessions. This last chart in terms of comparing where we are now is just the growth rates quarter by quarter. So economists like to look at economic growth, as you know. This is just the growth rate for quarters since this recovery began. The recovery began in the summer of 2009. That's when the recession ended. And I'm looking at here the quarters since it ended. The vertical axis is the growth rate. And there's comparing two recoveries. The recoveries we've had now, which is very modest. You can see that's the blue bars. and its average is about 2.1%. The red line is the growth rate following the recession in the early 80s, and it's much larger. It's almost 3 times as large. So in all these respects, you see something that is quite, I think, disturbing, is what's going on here. Not only do we have this crisis, did we have this deep recession, we're not coming out of it. And even though, when you talk about, oh, things are going to be better this year, it's usually going to, oh, it's going to be 2.5% maybe, 3%. It's not like those 4 or 5% numbers that we saw that got unemployment down fast in the past. Now, one reason to be concerned about this when you think about public policy and ethical issues is I worry people are beginning to forget about this. And I'll give you a little history example, I'd say, from my own experience. This is way back when I was an economist on President Ford's Council of Economic Advisors. I was that for a long time ago. And the economy wasn't doing so well in those days either. I'll talk about that in a minute. And so what we decided on the Council of Economic Advisors, Alan Greenspan was the chairman at the time, by the way, is that we would redefine what the normal rate of unemployment would be. People at the time in the 60s would say, you can get the 4% unemployment nationally. You should be able to do that. But we looked at the demographics, maybe the young people coming into the labor force, and figured that's probably a little too ambitious. Let's just adjust our sights a little bit to above 4. So we said 4.9. It's like pricing gasoline. We were afraid to say 5, so we said 4.9% unemployment. And trotted over to Capitol Hill to report to the Joint Economic Committee, then chaired by Hubert Humphrey, distinguished Democratic senator. He was outraged. He said, you economists, you know, if we had a plague in this country, and as a result people's body's temperature rose, your solution would be to redefine what normal temperature is. And effectively, that's what he's doing. Now, that was unemployment about 4.9. San Francisco at 6.7. And I say it's otherwise higher. So there's a concern here about losing track of these problems, especially when things are looking good for some people. Now, there's lots of theories about why this economy has not performed well so far. Of course, we hope it will get better. One theory is that the recession was so deep. This is what always happens in deep recessions. You hear that a lot. Let's face it, the crisis was really bad. Well, it's not true. In fact, in American history at least, the deeper the recession beforehand, the more rapid the recovery. And that goes for financial crises too. I have a little bar chart here to just sort of illustrate that. These are the growth rates following recessions back into the 1800s, deep recessions associated with the financial crises. They're defined by economic historians. And what I've drawn is a blue line, which is the average growth rate in the first couple years from those recessions. And you can see it's averaged about 6%. That's that blue line. The recovery from this recession is way down at 2%. And they're all higher than this one. So don't be fooled if someone tells you we're having low growth because the recession was big. It just doesn't add up. Maybe it could be the first time. Another issue that's sometimes raised, is deleveraging going on. Before the financial crisis, people borrowed so much, they overextended themselves, and they did, to be sure. And so now what you're seeing is people trying to save more to bring their debt levels down. And since they're saving so much, the story goes, they're not consuming enough, and therefore growth is slow because consumption's not high. Well, that doesn't add up either, because if you look at the data, people are saving a much smaller fraction of their income than in, say, the last deep recovery from a deep recession. So there's other things. Housing. Well, housing was a crash, and it's picking up, and that explained it. Well, all recoveries have weak sectors. In the 1980s, the international trade sector was even weaker than our housing market because the dollar was so strong. You can add to the list income distributions. My former colleague and friend Joe Stiglitz argues that the income distribution is keeping the economy from growing because the rich are getting more and they save too much. And the poor don't, but the data don't correspond to that either because savings rates are remarkably low. So I'm an analyst. I look through these stories and I come to a conclusion that those don't seem to add up. And so I come to me, the obvious conclusion that it's economic policy that's causing the problem. And when I think about economic policy, I'm going to think about it in the broadest sense. My research over many years has been in what some people call macroeconomics, monetary policy, fiscal policy, big picture types of things. So my view of economics is frequently colored by that. And that's where I sort of get these original ideas. But in studying it, looking at the micro sides, the stories are very similar. So I think you'll see my theory goes well beyond macroeconomics. So my theory is best described as we've gotten off track in following basic economic principles. I have a book called First Principles to illustrate this. I talk about this idea. And so there's different ways you can talk about economic policy screwing up, but this is the way that it makes sense to me because I've been teaching economic principles for so many years. So let me just list these, okay? And there's different ways to do this, but please think about this as a characterization of a good set of economic policies, at least from my perspective. I call them the principles of economic freedom. You can call them what you want. Basic idea is that individuals, families, entrepreneurs, everybody can make decisions about what to buy, what to sell, how to help other people, but they do this within a framework, and that framework is, I call it, predictable policy framework, so they know what the government is going to do. They can understand the strategy, if you like, the policies in place. That's the first. They do this within a strong rule of law, which of course also provides predictability, but also certainty. It also protects people. The rule of law protects freedom, if you like. The strong incentives are very important in terms of generating the good economic behavior. I think it's best if those incentives come from the market system, which is my fourth point. And ultimately, the fifth point is I say clearly defined and clearly limited role for government. And the last one, just to clarify a little bit, to me, when I teach economics, I emphasize cost-benefit. And when we think about a role for government, we say, is the government going to be able to do something better than the private sector? What are the costs or benefits? So in principle, you look at it that way. And that's all I mean. Just follow a cost-benefit analysis to decide on what, say, the federal government should be doing, what state governments and what local governments were doing. Now this framework, these 5 principles, if you like, of economic freedom, as I'm calling them, they've worked very well for America. In fact, I think in many respects this is what has characterized America's success since its founding. These are the strong rule of law. It's a market system, basically. You basically want to have a limited role of government, a lot of that in the Constitution. And so it's been very successful for America. And by the way, if you look at history, it seems to me it's been successful for other countries that have gotten close to this. And I'm going to just mention China, because when China moved away from the Mao policy of central planning, which ignored all these principles, every single one, and moved towards a more system which paid more attention to them, a long way to go, it was a miracle. Hundreds of millions of people have come out of poverty because of that. So you can debate whether this is exactly the way to put it forward, but to me this is not too dissimilar from what we teach, and I think it really is the success story of economics. Now, unfortunately, we swing back and forth from greater and lesser adherence to these principles over time, and that's what I've observed. Let's call them the shifting winds of economic freedom. And since I've been doing this business, maybe a little before, I've noticed several big shifts. And one is in the 60s and 70s, and I'm going to call that a shifting away from these key principles. And you just give some rough examples so you know what I mean. In the 60s and 70s, we had a very unpredictable monetary policy. The Fed would gun it and then pull back. We had, for the most part, a very interventionist fiscal policy. It started in the 60s, but continued right to the 70s. It would be short-term stimulus packages, which were not very predictable. We had, in this country, wage and price controls for the whole country, instituted by Richard Nixon, completely far away from ideas of what I have here in these principles. So we went far away, and the results were terrible. Let's face it, we got to double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation, growth slowed down. It's when I got interested in economics, because I couldn't believe how bad things were. Now, fortunately, the wind shifted back, and I'll say that's roughly the 80s and 90s. It began in the late 70s when people just got, really, I think, disgusted with the high inflation or the policies, and so it was changed. President Carter appointed Paul Volcker, different philosophy of monetary policy. It wasn't go, stop, go, stop. It was really more predictable. Let's get inflation down, and that'll be the best thing for unemployment. It basically ended the short-term stimulus packages and had a sort of a predictable policy put in place that happened to do with tax cuts, but the more important thing, it was a predictable policy. And you got rid of almost all of that intervention with wage and price controls. There's also a period where regulations tended to diminish compared to the 70s where they increased. So regulations, of course, are important, but they do represent less emphasis on the market system than fewer regulations. So again, it's an amazing to me correspondence between these different aspects of policy swinging back and forth. Anyway, as you well know, maybe don't know, this was a good period for economic performance. Economists call it the Great Moderation. Unemployment came down. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. We had inflation down. Growth started to pick up eventually. Wasn't perfect. I'll come back to that too. But so much better than in the past. So I look at the theories. I look at the theory that suggests this and the empirical things that actually have happened. Now, unfortunately, we've veered away again. I don't know exactly when to specify this. This is certainly not just in this current administration. It occurred in the last administration, but monetary policy became much less focused on just keeping inflation low and a steady policy. There was a period in 2003, 4, and 5 where interest rates were held very low, and that tended to accentuate the housing boom and eventually the crisis. Fiscal policy, 2008, there was a stimulus package, first big one we've had since the 70s. Why we got back to that, I don't really know. And there's more intervention in the economy generally, and I'll show you a picture of that too. So in any case, this is a quick summary. What are the results? Well, let me just put it. What has been associated with this? Terrible performance. A serious crisis, a serious slow recovery. And so it seems to me that's really what's going on here. And it's in a sense, it's just a correlation. But when you look at the details, at least when I look at the details and I see what's going on, this is the conclusion that I come to. A little schematic to think about this, if you like. This is not proof, maybe just a timeline to organize your thinking. This is the unemployment rate in the United States back to the 1940s until the most recent period. And I'm talking about these shifts back and forth. So, the first shift towards this, away from the principles I'm talking about, started in the, roughly speaking, the mid-60s. And it continued, and unemployment basically went up. You have the business cycles. Then you have this shift back. Look what happened to unemployment. And then I'm talking about this third period. Again, it's not proof, but it must make you think there's something going on here with respect to economic policy and the effect, this is the case on unemployment, the effect on people's lives, the effect on poverty, the effect on growth, the effect on income growth. So that's what I think. Now, I want to just think along with you about, if you like, the partisan aspect of this, because I don't think this is very partisan at all. So I want to ask the question, who gets us in and out of these messes? And you know what I mean by messes now. And it's a nonpartisan answer because I see it happening across parties. In my view, thinking about this, and people would disagree, a lot of this began in the early 60s. And the so-called Keynesian, I don't mean Keynesian in a theoretical way, I be a Keynesian in a theoretical way, I mean in the activist policy sense. Of sometimes economists talk about Keynes and the Keynesians. The Keynes is a very interventionist part of Keynesians. And it was written up in the Economic Report of the President in 1962. Very well articulated, one of the best economic reports of the President ever written. Very, very persuasive. At the same time, by the way, this is kind of a side, there was another view put forth. And this is actually a book, Capitalism and Freedom, written by Milton Friedman, 1962. It's the same year. He had a much different view. It's actually closer to my view here about the role of interventionism. But that view was pretty much ignored then because the Keynesians had the power in Washington. Now that continued, and as you saw my line, and by mid-60s, early 70s, things were going bad. They somehow got the Fed to cooperate. You have an independent central bank. At that point, William McChesney Barton was the chairman, and they were able to work with him, and he thought that he could cooperate, and so the Fed moved to these go-stop policies as well. It continued through the Johnson administration, and you had Nixon come in. Nixon came in with a different view, but very quickly changed for whatever reason, maybe political. He imposed wage and price controls on the economy, and that led to really very bad macroeconomic policy, let alone the inefficiencies that caused. It continued through President Ford, through President Carter, stimulus packages, interventions, and of course the monetary policy. So note, there's a Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter. This is not a partisan picture. Things began to change in the end of the 70s and the 80s, as I mentioned. I call it back from the brink. Got away from these policies. President Reagan had something to do with that, that's for sure, but remember, President Carter appointed Paul Volcker. But in any case, I think a recognition of these things were changing. Monetary policy joined in, I think supported, if you like, by President Reagan at that point, because he followed President Carter, of course, and continued with Paul Volcker. It continued certainly into the 1990s with President Clinton. These are not perfect characterizations. These are broad strokes. And of course, the welfare reform, which is very much an idea of limiting the federal government in terms of welfare policy, very, very much in that direction compared to the other. And then what about coming back again? Well, there was this activist revival. Actually, in 2001, there was a stimulus package. There's also some tax cuts, permanent tax cuts, but there was also a stimulus package under President Bush. Monetary policy got active again. And it quite frankly has, by 2008, another kind of interventionist stimulus package with President Bush towards the end of his term. And to me, I'll call it, I think it's doubling down since then. It has continued for the most part. And I can give you lots of evidence for that, or lots of pictures and lots of slides, but again, continue with this broad stroke characterization. Let me just give you a couple pictures of what I mean here about off track with policy. This is our debt as a percentage of GDP. I love this chart. It basically shows back to the 1700s that we had kept our debt to GDP ratio rather low. The blip there around 1950 is World War II, where we borrowed a lot. And for most of my career, that was a gigantic spike in the debt to GDP ratio. And then the rest of it is a projection, really, of where we're going if we don't change our policy. And that's up to date, including what has been happening recently. The projection is labeled, the way if you look at the top of there, a 2009 CBO projection. And that's, if you look carefully, that's 750% of GDP. The United States of America will not be the United States of America if that happens. So something's got to give. The red line is the 2012 CBO projection. All they did was stop going out so far, but it's exactly the same path. You say, oh, it's only 250%. No, they just cut it off there. And that's 2012, the most recent number they have. So I don't know, some of you don't look as scared by these numbers as I think you should be. One time I was lecturing in this hall, and I noticed my students didn't seem to be so frightened either. So I said, I'm going to bring a guest lecturer to the class the next day. So I brought a guest lecturer. She was my 9-month-old granddaughter. I brought her in here, held her in my arms, and fortunately she looks up at that screen and looks at me. Of course, she couldn't talk at 9 months. And it looked like she said something. I told the students, she said, fix it. And so they remembered fix it. But the truth is, she's almost 4. I brought her back. It's the same thing. We haven't fixed it. So that's an example, if you like, of a problem. It doesn't prove anything. Another example, these are the uncertainty that's in our policy. It's the number of provisions in the U.S. tax code that's expiring each year. So these are all temporary changes. And it's growing. Again, remember, this began before 2009. And I just put a little picture in here because the culmination of this was the cliff, which we just had last December. That's a self-imposed pain on the economy. We didn't have to have a cliff, but it's an example of this policy. Regulation's controversial. This is a picture of the number of federal workers employed in regulatory activities, including TSA employees. and I wrote the years there. It's 2006. So it's rising. So that's one indication that we're intervening more. Again, some of it's important to do, but it is a cost. And if you like to compare with that good period, look at what happened in the 80s. We're going the other direction. So these are facts. These are things you need to be concerned about. So my feeling is that the evidence is pretty clear. From the point of view of a good, healthy economy, the reason why we're not doing as well as we have in the past, in the 80s and 90s, is because of policy. And you can quibble around the edges, but it seems to me it's quite clear what is going on. And to fix it, you got to fix the budget. You got to Washington has to get a predictable fiscal policy. I'm not going to talk about monetary policy tonight, but it's the same thing. And the regulatory policy, I think, has to be rationalized. I believe if we do that, the performance will be much like we've seen in similar periods where we've stressed these principles directly or not. Now, having said all this, and we can talk about it in the questions a little bit more, but having said all this, some of you might be saying, isn't Taylor missing a big part of this story, especially in the 80s and 90s, which he characterized as the great moderation, where growth was strong and inflation was low and unemployment was coming down? Isn't he missing a big part of the story? And I am. And I'm missing a story which is, I think, important for this series of lectures, and that is income distribution. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So what about the income distribution? And you could say, yes, it was good the economy did so well in the 80s and 90s, in the way I'm describing it. And it was good for lower income groups that the unemployment rate was down and the inflation rate was down too. The poor frequently gets hurt by inflation. And it certainly would be good to get back to those days, if you like, of lower unemployment and stronger income growth. But don't forget, there's some other aspects of the 80s and 90s, maybe even the 70s, late 70s, that people focus on a lot. And that's the income distribution. It worsened in the sense got wide, and we heard about that in this lecture series from Emmanuel Saez. Lower income groups, as far as we can tell, did not benefit like upper income groups did in this particular period. And of course, some didn't benefit at all. And this is a large part of people's concern about the economy. So I want to talk about that. So first some pictures. And this comes from Saez's research, if not from the talk he gave. And it shows you the income share of the top 1% in the United States. It goes back to the 1920s. And you see this gigantic drop in World War II and basically a rather relatively steady income distribution. And then as things beginning to move up in the 1970s, in the 80s, in the 90s, and apparently until recently. And so just look carefully at this chart for a few minutes. Again, it goes back to just before 1920 and goes up to 2011. Okay, so it's very current. It's with and without capital gains. Capital gains are generally positive, but they're more volatile as well. And it's the share of income of the top 1%. And so that rise, beginning in the 70s sometime, is very pronounced. Taken literally, this picture shows that the income share now on the top 1% is less than it was in 2000. So you could say, well, this is going away. It looks like it's going away, but I think that's a little early to make that judgment given how volatile those lines are. But the full measure of income, including capital gains, the share is actually lower now, at least as of the latest data, compared to 2000. So this is the concern that people have. And we want to talk about whether we should be concerned and basically what we should think about doing about it. This is the same picture with the top 10%. So it's a different group. I'll talk about these definitions in a minute. The picture's the same. You still this gigantic drop around World War II, and then a relatively steady pattern for the top 10% and the bottom 90%. And again, starting somewhere in the 70s, it starts to move, and it slowed down a little bit. In this case, it really hasn't reversed for the top 10%. Much of the movement in the top 10% is driven by the top 1%, by the way. But I will tend to focus more on the top 10% in this discussion. So those are the data. Now, there's lots of reasons to think carefully about what this means before you jump to conclusions. That's my view. So I want to look at this as carefully with you as I can and try to come to an explanation and therefore come, and if it's a problem, come to a solution. So let's first just think some perspective. So first of all, you always should think about data, especially when you're looking at income distribution. These data come from the Internal Revenue Service, from reporting for the United States for tax reporting purposes. And so that means they are sometimes distorted by what people report. For example, if tax rates go down, people may have less incentive to not report income, so income can rise just by reporting measures. So there's these features in the data. It's also neither literally a family or a household measure. It's a tax filing unit. Sometimes that can be a couple, it can be a single, related people, and usually. And so so if there's a family composition changes because of more singles, that's going to change these numbers. So you got to think those things through carefully. And my feeling is, well, they do distort them. The story is pretty much the same when you take account of them. I actually think you always should think about the thresholds because it helps you get some intuitive sense of what's going on. The thresholds, I have a little chart for the thresholds. And the thresholds, I mean, is what income level is the top 1%, top 10%, et cetera. So this shows you that. So the top 10% begins at $110,000. I bet you know a lot of people that are in the top 10%. And the top 1% is $366,000 a year. And I bet you know a few people in that group too. So these numbers are not literally the Beyoncés and et cetera. These are people who are, I wouldn't say modest, but not the super income levels at the 1%. You also, I think, should recognize, as I show in my chart, that this is an important feature of these data is a fairly large fraction of that income is wage and salary income. In the 1920s, much of the income, the top 1%, was profits and interest, et cetera. It's now mostly wage and salary income. Third thing to think about is those data don't include the taxes and transfers. It's basically the total amount of income you report to the IRS. It's like a market income, if you like. And you can look at what's happened in the income distribution, and it's important to do so if you want to think about the problem, by looking at taxes and transfers. That is how much people pay in taxes and how much transfers they get in various kinds of welfare or entitlement programs. There are data on this, and here's a picture so you can put this in perspective. Gini coefficients, of course, are a measure of income inequality. These are Gini coefficients for the United States prepared by the OECD. It's done in different ways, but it's a little bit of history. It goes back to the mid-70s. And again, you can see the rising Gini coefficients for the blue line. That's before taxes and transfers, so that's comparable to the charts I showed before. And the rising number represents more inequality, and it's there. The red line is the after taxes and transfers, and so there's less inequality after taxes and transfers because people are receiving income and they're paying taxes. So that reduces the inequality. You can see that too. The red lines, red bars are below the blue bars. However, note that both of them have the same pattern. Roughly speaking, the same pattern, a slight increase during this period. So it's not as if major changes in tax and transfer system are the direct cause of this change in distribution. They're basically the same picture. It's important to get the best data you can. So here's another data source. This comes data collected by the Congressional Budget Office. It tells much the same story, but I just want to emphasize that. So these are also these Gini coefficients. And the market income, that's before taxes and transfers, so you can see it going up over time. These numbers are a little larger, but the trend up was pretty clear. It starts in 1979. And then you see the market income when you include transfers, and so that reduces the inequality. And then if you include the taxes as well, it comes down further. But the spread between those is not changing very much. So you can't say directly this is because just at least in terms of these summations, that it's because of a change in the tax system of the rich or the welfare programs for the poor. It's a market income-based phenomenon, and so you want to look for look at market causes for the most part. The last thing on my list of perspectives is international. Actually, I have one more illustration of the taxes and transfers, mainly because I just like this picture, but it's kind of fun. This is a picture of the share of income in 5 quintiles in 2 years, 79 and 2007, lowest, second, et cetera. And you see the big at the top, and you see the 1% in the blue line there. And this is the case after transfers and taxes, okay? And so that's like a distribution. And then here's what you get before. That's just the market income. And so I'm going to go back and forth between these two a few times, and you can see how the transfers and taxes reduce the share for the top and increase the share for the bottom. But they really haven't changed that much across this interval of time from 79 to 2007. So various ways to look at this, but it seems to me you come to the conclusion that it's not, at least in this arithmetic sense, the tax and transfer system or changes in it that's driving these changes. It's something else. That's the international side, so that it's clear that this is not simply a United States phenomenon, although in this picture it's most pronounced for the United States. So these are data, as you can see, is Australia, Canada, France, et cetera. The US is the greenish one, and that shows the, if you like, the worst deterioration. That's also the SIAS data. And then you can see some of the Canada and the UK, it's similar, and not so much with respect to, Sweden depends on when you include capital gains, but there's this general tendency here for the income distribution to become more concentrated in recent years. Again, the US looks like it's more pronounced. It could be a data issue, we don't know for sure. But I think when you think about this, you've got to put this international thing in perspective. Whatever it is, it seems to be more general than one country. A little more perspective on this, because every time I talk about this topic, people ask me questions, oh, this doesn't prove that, that doesn't prove this is a different thing. So just run through these things quickly, because they influence how I think about it. What we look at with the income distribution, of course, is questions about equality of outcome, what actually people get. And there's other very important ways to think about equality. Equality of opportunity, that's almost like economic freedom, the idea that someone has the ability to make the most of their life. They're not repressed by some other people or by government itself. Equality of opportunity, of course, personal equality, the idea that all men are created equal is an important part of our philosophy, if you like, at least my philosophy. Equality of opportunity and personal equality are essential. And equality of outcome may not come from that. Some people do better than others. And so, again, Beyonce and Jay-Z, they're doing really, really well. And they've got opportunities, but their outcome is much different than others. I think we need to keep those straight when you look at these numbers. They just tell you about equality or lack thereof of outcome. Mobility is a very important thing to stress when you look at those income, because they're just static pictures of what the income is for a group at a particular point in time. They don't tell you about whether someone at the bottom went to the top or someone at the top went to the bottom. Essential for assessing equality of opportunity, for example. And unfortunately, there's a lot of ambiguity when you look at studies of this. I have actually taught in my classes that we've had a considerable amount of income mobility over time, but data are beginning to question that are coming out. So less mobility than we saw. The mobility would be described as the number of people that move from the first quintile to the bottom quintile to the top quintile. And those numbers are, I think they're good, but they're not as good as you like. The intergenerational mobility is probably another great concern. In the United States, I always think about the intergenerational mobility as essential, that somebody can start with rags and end with riches. And by the way, riches go to rags, the same direction. But unfortunately, looking at this intergenerational mobility, the likelihood of someone being well off if their parents well off, seems to be increasing, at least according to some studies. And the last year's economic report of the president wrote about this. These are very difficult questions. I assume they're the kind of questions that occupy people at the center. Issues of inheritance and parental assistance. We want parents to read to their kids, but it gives the kids a better chance. You know, it helps them. It creates more income correlation. So anyway, I think these are things that I want to like be informed when I look at these numbers. A lot of economists say that it's not so bad if you look at inequality of consumption, how much people consume. If you got a net worth of $700 million, you're not going to consume that much more than someone with lower income. You're going to consume more, of course, but there'll be more equality. And here, unfortunately, the data are mixed too. If you just look at consumption data, it is more equal, but there's still inequality and it's increased. And here's, some people will say, well, you know, it's a terrible measure because anybody can watch the Super Bowl now. You don't have to be rich to watch, you don't have to be in the top 1% to watch a Super Bowl. You can have just as much enjoyment if you're in the bottom 5% or 10%. And so this is, again, an important thing to think about when we assess the quality of our society. I think the safety net is an important thing to think about, that we're helping the least well off. And to me, probably more important, to show you my biases in the relative income, I'm very concerned with the people at the bottom. That's a different concept than straight income distribution. Safety net's very important. Let's not forget there are benefits from this. We like to watch those stars, those athletes. It's a benefit to us, and philanthropy is an incredibly important thing for this university, and that comes because of the income distribution that we have. So I go through all these things, and I could go through more, and you could go through more, and they're the subject of great seminars and long discussions. But when I do, I come to the conclusion that nonetheless, if you like, despite all this, there is a concern here. And this income distribution change is a serious concern. To me, it reflects a concern about inequality of opportunity. It's a sign there may be some opportunity problems, and I'm going to call that lack of economic freedom problems in a minute. But it's also a real concern for the lower income groups themselves. The high unemployment rate in the Central Valley is hurting people, long-term unemployment. And so these are things that I think income distribution data help you understand and address. So given that we are concerned, what do we do about it? And so I want to look at the data a little more to do that. And I'm going to go back to the Emmanuel Saez data. And to just focus a little bit, look at the 10% at the top and the 90%. And remember, that's $110,000 threshold as of 2011, so you know what we're talking about. And this picture relates to the first part of my talk about how the economy was terrible in the 70s and got better in the 80s and 90s, and then terrible since. That was a characterization with respect to unemployment, overall income growth, poverty, et cetera. So I'm dividing this into the same periods, if you like. I'm not going back to the 1920s. I'm going to start at the end of World War II. And what we're now looking at is the percentage change in real income for these two groups. So the average income in the 10% and how much it grows over time. Okay, so on the vertical axis, you see like 50%, 100%, et cetera. That's the percentage change since 1948 in these. So if these lines are moving together, that's roughly the same growth rate. If they're spreading apart, that's a higher growth rate for the top and lower growth rate for the bottom, which you're going to see in a minute. So that's kind of a characterization of what has happened to income in these top 10 and everyone else. So as I look at this, I see nice income growth in the 50s until somewhere in the mid-60s. And I drew that line there. That's not data. That's just my eyeball in it when it seemed to flatten out, if you like. And then things seemed to flatten out. Until 1965 or 66, whenever that is, there wasn't much change in income distribution because the percentage growth was about the same for both, okay? So fine. Then you move into the period which I had criticized a few minutes ago, late 60s and 70s, and you see a big change here. It's not a change in income distribution because both the 10 and the 90 are growing about the same rate. but they're both doing terribly compared to where they were before. So to me, that's in terms of relative characterizations of groups, that's how you think about those bad days in the 70s, if you like. That's the bad days. No much growth in real terms at all. Then you see something really quite dramatic happening. And that's the beginning with this good period I was referring to, the 80s and 90s. When growth was good, unemployment was coming down, and poverty was being reduced. And here you see the top 10% going like gangbusters. The arrow stops around 2000. And everybody else sort of meandering just like they did in the 70s. Okay? And then you have the turbulence of recent years where, at least as far as I can tell, nobody's done very well. That's another characterization of the bad times that we've had recently. Both the bottom 90, they're really having trouble now with this recession and slow recovery. But so the top 10%, that's including capital gains. As I mentioned earlier, they're actually, their growth is down since 2000. So what's going on here? And I think it's really important to try to understand this. I like it, the way to think about it, because it corresponds to the time periods I began with, the unemployment going up and down and that kind of thing, the macro stuff, but this is sort of the distribution. So when I think about this, I don't come to taxes as the first explanation. I come to some other things, and that has to do with education. This is a picture, what I'll call the returns to education. And it starts, it goes back to mid-60s. But you can see it's the relative wage of if you go to college compared to high school, or if you go to graduate school, MBA or something like that. And starting around late 70s, early 80s, this shifted. It's a well-known thing by many people have researched. This is a chart from Kevin Murphy, presented here a few years ago. This is well-known and documented in different ways. The return to education has increased. In the sense you're doing better if you go to college, even better if you go to graduate school, better if you graduate from high school compared to if you don't. Okay, it's about that same time. So that's possibly something that's going on here. Now, if you were thinking like an economist, you would say, hey, the returns are higher. That should make more people want to get these degrees. It should increase the supply. And that would tend to attenuate the benefits. That would tend to reduce the returns. When more people would be there, tend to reduce the returns. But the returns have stayed high. So what's going on? Well, it looks like there's something wrong with the education system that's causing this. People don't seem to be continuing in school. And here's a picture which I think is very telling. So even though the returns to education have increased, the amount of schooling is going down. This is a picture, this is due to Jim Heckman at the University of Chicago, who's worked to document these statistics a lot. This is high school graduation rate, that's the top line there. And this is by year of birth, so you gotta be careful. So 1950 would be people graduating from high school around 1970. And you can see the terrific history we have had in this country of more and more people graduating from high school and going up. And it peaked. It looks like it peaked around 1970, early 70s. And it's actually gone down since then. Okay, so it's kind of the reverse of what you'd think would happen if there's more benefits to education. This is true for males and females. Just show the picture. This is for males. It's actually come down a little further for males. I'm just focusing on the top line here, the high school graduation rate. But it's also come down for females, and not quite as much. So we have this phenomenon here where returns have gone up, but the supply, and of course these are just a few illustrative pictures. You have to tell a bigger story to prove this, but it's true. Supply has not increased. Now why? And here it seems to me is where I come back to my concept of economic freedom and opportunity. We have basically removed a lot of the freedom for people to get better schooling in this country during this period of time. I don't know exactly when it started, but it's clearly there, and it's a real problem. Just look at the total for a minute, that decline. And to me, it reflects, if you like, and I'll put it just back in my terms about economic freedom, it reflects restrictions on the ability for people to advance. Why is the high school graduation rate down? Largely because the kids get into high school are not ready to graduate. They drop out. Their teachers are terrible, or they didn't get the right school. They went to that terrible school. So I think of this as an economic freedom issue. It's whether it's government or society, there's a tendency to prevent people from seeking out better education, and whether it starts at 3 years old or it's 7 years old or 15 years old or whatever it is, it's there. And this is evidence of that. And so what's going on? How can we actually prevent that? And I think there's different ways to look at it. You could go back. We need more regulation. We need more taxes on the rich. It seems to me that the logical implication and the deepest concern that I have from looking at these numbers is that we have been failing in providing for these opportunities. I personally think that the ability to change your school to get a better education if you want to is the key here. And we've studied this. People looked at it. It's very controversial. One of my favorite movies is this one, Waiting for Superman. It's about 5 little kids. Anthony, Daisy, Emily, Francisco, and Bianca. And their parents all wanted them to get a better school than they had, whether it was in East Los Angeles or in New York. And so they applied to better schools. Well, at least they thought they were better. Charter schools. They're all public charter schools. And the bars indicate the chances of getting in. Maybe you probably saw that movie. So Anthony, 37%, Daisy, 5%, Emily, 20%, Francisco and Bianca, virtually 0. And you saw these pictures, these kids and their parents trying to, if you like, get more freedom, more economic freedom so they could advance and really improve their lives. And the majority, of course, didn't get in. So to me, this is what's going on, and why really my theme here is, if you like, economic freedom has missed a good group of people as we promoted it in this period of recent years, if you like, since the late 70s and 80s. The idea here of economic freedom that comes from this whole perspective, if you like, I think can be broadened. And the education is perhaps the one that's most clear to all of us, because we see it, and it's frustrating, so frustrating. That's the first one I've listed here. If you don't have the freedom to improve your education, or you're stuck in a poor school and you can't get out and the government won't let you, whatever it is, the wealthy are just fine. They can get out to go to a different school area or go to a private school. You're stuck. Well, that leads to these low graduation rates, I think, low test scores, and of course the low wages. That's part of that lower 90% problem. But I think it's broader than that. And all of the things that I've been talking about that affect the overall economy, I think they affect this distribution. So I just list a few. Regulatory capture, that's what happens when financial institutions get the regulators to let them take on a little risk, and frequently it's done because of whatever it is, friendships, cronyism. That affects the income distribution. It tends to help the wealthy compared to the poor. And of course, the high risk are very dangerous since the financial crisis. So don't just think of that as a macro. Bailouts of large financial institutions. Who does that help? There's excuses to do it. You don't want the economy to crash, that's what's said. But we're actually protecting the biggest firms. That's the too big to fail, because we're concerned about them failing and causing. So they get higher profits. So the same, if you like, I would call, again, these deviations from rules. These are regulatory capture makes you bend the rules. It's a deviation from a good rules-based policy, good from my principles. Same with too big to fail. You're basically intervening in the general way the market works. Failed firms stop. And then I would even add monetary policy is my favorite subject. I'm worried about monetary policy having the same effects now by helping perhaps insiders who know how to deal with the highly discretionary policies or giving these low returns to retirees. So just touching the surface, but you can see where I'm driving at here. And I think the message that I'm concluding in this talk, coming to in this talk, as stressing in this talk, is there are some things we need to do. There's some, that's my conclusion. So just to review this, I think a greater adherence to these principles, and you can define them perhaps in different ways, would improve the macro performance. That's kind of been my big thing for the last few years. Very tragic to me what's happened. This is my discipline. But I also think it would help people with lower incomes and improve the income distribution. Now, I'm sure to many of you it probably sounds terribly counterintuitive. How could more reliance on the market or competition as those things that frequently seem so unfair, how could that make things better? But I'd ask you to consider history. Consider what happened in China. And they did move towards those principles, not all the way, for sure. Hundreds of millions of people come out of poverty. How can you just ignore that? And I'd say even more dramatically, think of what's happening in China right now. They're also concerned about the income distribution. Big topic, reforms, new government wants to try to deal with this income distribution for whatever reason. What are they doing to deal with it? I think if you look carefully, they're trying to get more economic freedom. They're letting the state-owned enterprises pay dividends to people. They're allowing small firms to get credit from banks that couldn't get it before. They're allowing more rural-urban migration and the rights to hold property in urban areas. Those are all in the directions of more economic freedom. So they're approaching this problem in the way I'm suggesting it. They're trying to. I don't know if they'll get there, but they don't talk about it as if it's a problem. It's just common sense. You know, somehow we've lost that common sense, it seems to me. So I think also just consider that there is some, I always like to emphasize that once you identify a problem, you should begin to get optimistic because you know how to deal with it. And in fact, I think we're seeing some signs. Just a couple of charts and I'll finish. These are really efforts to use more freedom in the states. This is a little voucher program in Florida. It's a picture of a disadvantaged child, and you can see the number of people taking advantage of these programs for students with learning disabilities, and it's growing very rapidly. That's Florida, that's Indiana. Indiana has tripled in the last year. It's a mother and a kid who are taking advantage of this program. It's all over the place, and you don't have to have those kids from Waiting for Superman. There are real kids out there, and there should be a lot more, and so that's my conclusion. So going back to the Stanford seal, let the winds of freedom blow, but let the winds of freedom blow for everybody. Thank you. So Rob tells me there may be some questions, so if anyone has some.
Okay. Excuse me, first I'll just say I am not an economist, and I was out of the country for about 20 years and exploring different types of democracy, social democracy, exploring many different systems. And in coming back here and trying to really understand the economics globally and nationally, so one of the things that I've come across is statements about the Federal Reserve and how it's really a private corporation that was developed and that they have an interest. They keep the economy at a certain level. They keep the distribution between the highest 1%, the highest 10%, and the 90%. That's in their interest. And people have said, and I feel a little bit naive, just kind of trying to understand things. But people have said, well, that's big money, and big money wants it that way, and they keep it that way. And then looking at it at a global level, it seems that there's like this same group that wants the global market to be in its interest and just keeps it that way.
So I'd say, first of all, the Federal Reserve, it wasn't set up to keep the distribution the way you're describing it. It's basically got a purpose, which is, we think of it as trying to keep the overall economy stable and keep inflation low, and as a result have a good, steady economy. And in fact, you can see bad periods like the 70s where they screwed up on that, and then relatively good periods in the 80s and 90s where they did well. Now, when they do other things, there's always the possibility that they're going to give advantages to the people who are very savvy. And so if discretionary policy, that's where they don't, it's not really clear what the policy is. You have to be an insider to know. And so that will tend to give advantages to the people with these skills that are able to do it. So it doesn't help the income distribution. In addition, many central banks and ours too, has some responsibility for the regulation of the financial institutions. And here there is a potential problem. I mean, if the policy is done well, you can avoid it, but there's a potential problem to have this, what they call capture, as the financial institutions will try to work with the regulators to get more favorable policy. One of the best popular books on this, which I recommend, is Reckless Endangerment. I'd take a look at that. Gretchen Morgenson, Joshua Rosner, he may be speaking here. I don't know, is Josh speaking here? Rosner from the, no. Anyway, it's a good book, and it sort of outlines this potential of regulatory capture. In that case, it was for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and how they were allowed by the regulators to do much more risky behavior than they otherwise would. Here's one here.
I noticed your comments on the stimulus of '08. I'm not sure if that was intended to include '09, but the 860 billion from Obama, in my book, was positive, and it helped us from a deeper dive. What's your opinion of the '09 stimulus?
So I didn't mention it, but I would disagree. The 2008 stimulus was similar in the sense that you had payments given to individuals so that they would consume and try to jumpstart the economy. If you look, I looked at that very carefully, and believe me, it's controversial, but when I see incomes rose, the people got the checks, they didn't spend the money. They basically kept it, and it didn't jumpstart the economy. In 2009, it was a much bigger package, and it included not only those payments, which had the same property, in my view, that people didn't use it to jumpstart the economy, but in addition, it had payments to the states. And the payments to the states, when I looked at that numbers, I saw the money going into the state and local governments, and I didn't see the infrastructure programs getting started. It basically looked, and if you look at their accounts, they put a lot of the money went into their own savings, or they borrowed less and did about the same amount. So there are people who have different conclusions than I do, but that's my assessment. But do you have a follow-up?
Thank you. And then 2 years later, after that, they started laying off. And so you had this reduction of demand from municipalities and states and counties.
Yeah, well, their demand stopped earlier than that. In fact, that's what I say. They basically stopped their activity, and you can't see much effect of the stimulus payments. I would say that, say a light rail project or something was already in the books, and they get the money from the federal government, and they say, well, we don't have time to have a whole new light rail project. This is already planned. We're going to go for this. So they take the money and they borrow less. And so that's what you'll see. You will see the same light rail project. I don't want to say this is easy to measure. Economics is tough, but that's what I found. Okay? Yeah.
When I look at your list of economic freedom principles, and I think about the history of the United States, the period of time where it seems to me that these principles were so well in effect was the 1920s, but that resulted in a very severe endpoint. So I wonder if you would comment on that.
Well, I think some of them were, but you did have towards the end of the 1920s this boom, and a lot of people thought that was really the reasons why we got into trouble in the recession. But I'd say for the most part, the 20s were pretty good. I mean, compared to the 30s. Well, that's a question. What caused the disaster? I said one possibility it was this kind of over-exuberance, but historians and the two most famous monetary economic historians of this are Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman, and they concluded that it was the problem of the Fed during the Great Depression that got they would say it turned into a normal business cycle into the Great Depression. Plus we had, again, to try to be nonpartisan, Herbert Hoover raised taxes. He had a big trade bill, a Smoot-Hawley trade bill, and you had an increase in the excess profit tax with FDR. By the end of the 1930s, the economy was still in a shambles. It wasn't until the war that things really began to pick up. So I'd say that, to me, that was the problem, not the 20s. That would be you always will have downturns. Not during the downturn. No, not during the downturn. Right. Well, I think the period of the 20s is really is before Hoover, as Hoover comes in later, and that policy was not good by Hoover, and I think that's really what caused the problems. But I would not blame the 20s for the 30s. Just like I wouldn't blame, some people might, I wouldn't blame the 90s on where we are now. Doesn't seem right to me. Is there a question right behind you?
In response to one of the previous questions, you said that the money from the 2009 stimulus went into savings,
Yes.
both individual and by the states. But in your talk, you mentioned that the savings rate during that period, this current period, was no bigger than in past downturns.
Right.
So where did the money in the past downturns come from to go into savings?
So in the
This time it
recovery-
came,
Yeah,
at least in part, from the stimulus. Last time we didn't have big stimuluses before the downturns.
in the
So where did it come from before?
So in the 70s, we had stimulus, and the same kind of thing happened. So President Ford had a stimulus. It didn't have much effect. In fact, there's a little personal story. I worked for President Ford, and when he did that, we analyzed it afterwards, and we said in our economic report of the president that didn't work. It was we analyzed. Same for the same reason. People largely
I think those were tiny stimulus compared to 2009.
2009, yes, but not you had 2008, same thing. 2008 was not a trivial stimulus. The same thing
in
happened.
the 70s, it was tiny.
Let me answer your question, though, because it's a good one. These are relatively small impulses, and so the money comes in, and spending doesn't go down. So people will save that amount, but that amount of saving is low compared to the total amount of saving over 3 or 4 or 5 year period. So the personal savings rate, on average, in this expansion has been about, say, 3%. In the 1980s expansion, it was about 10%. Those are the facts, 10% versus 3%. In the 1980s, we didn't have the stimulus packages. I'm not saying that's the whole reason. The economy was growing. People saw they could save and still consume because their income was growing. Here, in this case, income's not growing very much, so people are saving a lot and not consuming very much. It's mainly the low income growth that's causing the low consumption, and that would also correspond to the low purchases by the state and local governments. Their income growth is very low. Okay, over here. Gotta walk over here.
I wanted to applaud your focus on inequality of opportunity as a major problem that we're facing, and I would agree with you that it's likely a big part of the story as to why we're not getting adequate investment in education. I think that was an important part of your talk. And where I might, though, disagree is as regards to diagnosis of that inadequate investment in education and our major problems with inequality of opportunity. And it seems like an argument, I think a compelling argument could be made to the effect that the main problem here is inequality of condition, our extraordinarily high income inequality. And if you're so lucky as to be born, say, into a professional managerial family, that family now has much more money to spend than they did in the past. And they can use that money for the purposes of assisting their children. They can move to gated communities. They can make sure that their children have access to high quality schools. They can assist with test preparation and so forth. They have so much more money now for the purposes of reproduction than was the case before. And so the question that I want to pose to you is, how can we take on the inequality of opportunity problem without taking on the inequality of condition problem, which makes it possible for much more reproduction to occur now than was the case before?
So to me, the simple answer is you address the fact that the people with the low incomes are unable to take at least more advantage than what they have now. You basically, whatever, it's scholarships, it's tax deductibility, whatever it happens to be, so there's more opportunities for them. You have more charter schools, so they don't have to go through these lotteries or whatever it is. That seems to me the way you address it. With respect to parents who have more capabilities, I don't want to limit their capabilities. That's sort of going backwards. You know, we want parents to read to their kids. We don't want to say you can't read to your kids because you're rich or something. We want to give all the opportunities there are. So to me, you focus on the great lack of opportunity that is there. That's the way I do it. It's hard to get there. It's just a trickle right now, but I just think that would be the answer. There's another important part of your question is, I think this to some extent is why we may be finding less intergenerational mobility in some studies than we used to have, because parents who have the capabilities, they see that these returns to education are higher, so they're going to make extra effort for their kids to get that education. And so that means their kids will be better because they took advantage of getting their kids to a better school or better reading to whatever it happens to be. And so that will perpetuate this inequality. In fact, it may make the inequality worse currently, because those who have the capabilities will invest even more in their kids because they see the returns to education are higher. In the meantime, other people don't benefit. So right here, yeah, over here.
Could you discuss a little bit GDP? We see so many references to this to GDP and that percent to GDP. And there seems so many estimates going into things, whether it's a good unit of measurement or whether we should seek something else to measure production or debt relative to other aspects.
Well, gross domestic product is one measure of the total amount that's produced in a given year in a given country. And it doesn't include everything. You know, people have these happiness indicators that try to be more general, or they don't include some of the costs of pollution. I think of it as more, it's just a number. It's a number that, not a perfect number. It can be better, but it's a representation of the total amount that's being produced, and therefore the total amount that's being earned in an economy at a particular point in time. And so I would say the numbers on GDP I focused on here, where you see these big differentials in growth, so even I think if you adjusted maybe for the underground economy where we're not counting, or for other measures, you're gonna find that. It's not a perfect measure, but it's fine for my purposes here. I don't know if that helps.
Is there a single measurement of that in forecasting the future? Does every economic group estimate their own GDP by their own method, or however they pursue it?
Well, we have, there's these measures were developed by economists way back when, very famous economists, and the government took them over, and now they use them. And there's just one little thing on this. Some are very hard to measure, like services. How do you measure services? So it's not perfect, but I don't think, I wouldn't, to be as objective as I can, I don't think anything I've said in this talk is dependent on a particular measure of GDP. Here, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation tonight.
Thank you.
It seems that in some essence they have the economic freedom that government intervention or regulation might not assist that. And I wonder what your thoughts are. Is there some elements of government regulation which are important, and maybe looking at the fact that there's been a popular view perhaps that the repeal of Glass-Steagall led to some difficulties,
yeah,
and that maybe there is a role for the government in some way to help us or help those who should otherwise be reined in some way?
So regulation is definitely important, and the financial system in particular. I think what I see happened for the most part was regulations on the books were not enforced enough. That's this regulatory capture I mentioned. I mentioned Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, but also the commercial banks. It doesn't mean that wasn't all the problem. Certain things should have been regulated. So people took on too much risk because of that. But I think my stress here is that we're not following the rules that are there. It's really, it becomes unpredictable. There's supposed to be, a rule of law. And so a rule of law doesn't mean you override the bankruptcy code and bail out a firm. That's violating the rule of law. You want to try to find a way to stick to it. Sticking to the rule of law doesn't mean you allow a financial institution either through ineptness or a favor to take on what it should be doing. That's my stress here tonight. I'm not saying you certainly need to have those regulations, and maybe they should be more or less, but that's not the main focus of what I'm saying. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, I have to, could I take two more because he was here and then the one in the back, I have to do the one in the back. Okay, right here.
Just a quick question. Within your model of economic freedom, how does the corporatization of local businesses fit in? I.e., your banks are owned by Wells Fargo and Bank of America, your pharmacies are owned by CVS and Walgreens and so on. Is that regulatory capture and distortion, or is it just the ultimate winner-take-all?
Well, it would be regulatory capture or distortion if, because the large organization was able to get special favors from a government regulatory agency more than a small firm could. That would be the concern. I'm not saying that large firms are bad any means, but to the extent that they are more able to take advantage of the regulatory system, then there's a problem. That is exactly the problem I'm talking about. Way in the back.
Thank you for your discussion tonight. Colin Supko, I'm a student here at the GSB. Two questions. First, would you have let GM go bankrupt? Two,
it went bankrupt.
Would you have allowed it to stay the course and not done anything to bail them out?
Yeah, I would not have done the bailout the way it was done, absolutely. But remember, they did go through bankruptcy. It was very clumsy. The way the whole thing was destructive. It seems to me that what you want to do, and I wasn't there, I wasn't inside the rooms, and I have been inside the rooms when decisions like that were made, but not on that one. And the thing what policymakers have to do is they have to find alternatives to these bailouts whenever they can. And I'm working very hard on a research project. It's called Chapter 14, because I want to have a new bankruptcy code for large financial institutions, right? And so then the policymakers say, hey, we don't have to bail these guys out. There's Chapter 14. There's an organized way for them to reorganize their debts. We can diminish the too big to fail kind of problem. So I would say that you never know. It's very hardest thing in the world right now is for a policymaker to say no to a bailout, and because they don't have many alternatives. And I think we got to find a way to deal with that.
And last,
okay,
but equally as important, I think.
I'm sorry?
I said last, but equally as important is, as we look to the future of our nation, where we have increasing debt, increasing deficits, how can we create the market, the sense of responsibility for every citizen to move against that force, which has really taken us down like a death spiral?
Well, Rob introduced me with the tie that democracy is not a spectator sport, and I believe that thoroughly. And so the more you can get involved in political campaigns, whatever side you happen to be on, or be informed and inform other people. I use a lot of graphs in here tonight. I hope you tolerate me for all these graphs. Graphs are hard for people, out there. So it's a hard message to get across. But thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much, John.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming tonight.